Jewish day schools, and the fact that the government doesn't provide equally for the Jewish community in our schools means that we don't have to pay our full taxes because we're already paying for public education that we're not benefiting from. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying I don't know whether anyone's brought that up as another rationale for avoiding or evading taxes.
No, none of the poskim that I've seen have brought up that argument. But the
I meant
fact,
amongst our chevra, whether anyone said it, because I think
oh
the
no,
Rav
no,
keeps asking what other examples might there be, and I think that's something that's I've heard said.
you're saying as far as what other justifications might there be? Yeah, no, no one's raised that argument. It's an interesting argument, which basically says that the government is taking more of my money than the services that they're providing. What would
Correct.
what would a person who doesn't have children say? Does that only
Right.
work? Does that only work if you have children? But
I
if
can
you
hear.
don't, but
Yeah.
and by the way, does a person without children pay more taxes or less taxes than the person who does have children? Usually, you pay less taxes when you have children. You get them as write-offs. So
Yeah. There are little deductions.
right, they're deductions. So the calculation doesn't seem to work. In other words, just so what does that mean? Because the government is spending some of its taxed funds on services that I don't use, that means that I have a right to not give the government money that they have said that I have to give them. So if you understand, like the Rambam, that evasion of tax is gezela, midioraisa, is biblical stealing. So then the argument that you're essentially making is that it is permitted for me to steal from someone who is supposed to be giving me services that I can't avail myself of, so I'm permitted to steal from them. That doesn't make very much sense. It doesn't make very much sense when you sort of break it down into its logical components.
And the other aspect in favor of what the Rav is saying is that we benefit as a society from all children being educated, and otherwise we'd have a criminal element and we wouldn't have a normal basic society. So everyone benefits, including those who don't have children, from public education.
Well, yeah, but a person might say, "Well, I don't agree with that. I think that our public school system is doing a horrible job at educating our kids and is actually grooming future criminals." Let's say a person were to make that argument. Does that justify stealing from the government? I still don't think it does. There are many services that the government taxes for that you and I will never benefit from. So many of those services are things that I'm ideologically opposed to. So, for example, the government might take some of its tax dollars and send it to the Palestinian Authority, like Trudeau has just done. He's just sent, what is it, a $25 million aid package to the Palestinians.
Yep.
And let's say the government has a program that will fund surgery to help a man become a woman or a woman become a man. And I'm ideologically opposed to the government doing that because I think it's morally wrong.
Yeah, assisted dying,
Yeah,
abortion.
yeah, assisted dying, abortion, all of these things that you can make an argument for. So why should I pay the government for those things? Well, sir or madam who makes that argument, let's break it down. Tell me how much of your dollar is going towards that. Can you demonstrate that to me on a spreadsheet? And if you can you then make the argument that the law of Gezela that the Rambam says is midioraisa is still justified, even based on the fact that you can actually extract how many dollars and cents you're permitted to steal? I mean, so again, all of these arguments, when looked at from a fuzzy logic kind of point of view, and when you take your glasses off and you want to be able to make the argument, it's great, but it doesn't really endure a real strenuous kind of test.
Yep, I hear. Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure, sure. So we were just finishing off this paragraph. We were talking about paying taxes in Eretz Yisrael, where the law of Dina de Malchus Dina applies in Israel, and we said that we're not going to research this extensively, but there are two different arguments. One is that despite the fact that you may not be obligated to pay a monarch who rises in the land of Israel, because if you see, the law of Dina de Malchus Dina, that you have to obey the laws of the land, is based on either the fact that the king has a rights of seizure of your property, or it's based upon the fact that the public agrees by consensus for a government to collect money from them. But either way, right? So if you subscribe to the first argument, so then it's a weaker argument to support a Dina de Malchus Dina in the land of Israel, because the land does not belong to any particular government entity. It belongs halachically to the Jewish people. And so one could possibly make the argument that the laws of Dina de Malchus Dina do not apply in Eretz Yisrael. But on the other hand, if you hold that it's based on the fact that the citizenry, by consensus, agrees to conform to the government rules, so then that argument would apply equally both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. And furthermore, we saw the argument that when you have a democratically elected government, there might even be a more compelling reason to obey, because that means that it's clearly the will of the people that this government institutes certain rules and including rules of taxation of property. And the last thing that we saw yesterday is that even if you were to take a more lenient position in the laws of Dina de Malchus Dina, it would never permit you to physically or actively steal from the government by taking money or grants from the government illegally, by lying or misrepresenting facts, by saying, that you're entitled to certain government programs when in reality you're not, or to say that you're a nonprofit institution when in reality you are, and so forth and so on. In other words, to commit tax fraud, there would never be an excuse, even in Eretz Yisrael. It's one thing to try to evade taxes in Eretz Yisrael, where you might be able to find a defensible position if you hold that Dina de Malchus is based on land ownership. However, and then finally, I think we just missed these last few lines. He says, "V'chein kasav b'shut shevet halevi." We saw this also in the Tshuva Sefer Shevet Halevi. He says, "Umasha kasav mevohal echad." What a very confused person wrote, "The kevan she'ein mitnahagim al pi haTorah mutar legozlam." That because the government in Israel does not abide by halacha, it is permitted to steal from them. Ve'ein lahem bailus klal, and they have no rights of ownership to my land. Udavar she'ein ro'ui lahashiv. He says this kind of argumentation does not even deserve a response. The chalila lahatir iser geneva ugezela betolim atzmam lashav be'ilan gadol. He says, God forbid that we would ever permit the prohibition of theft based on these kinds of frivolous arguments. And like the language he uses, betolim atzmam lashav be'ilan gadol, and they're hanging themselves for naught on a large tree. That could mean one of two things. Either they're relying on a great tree, meaning a great rabbinic voice, and they're relying on that for naught, or it could mean they're actually hanging themselves. But I'm not sure which one he means in this context. But in any event, it's clear that that it is not permitted. Now, I noted that when I was in LA, my son davens at a shul called Adas Torah, and they publish, and this is actually one of my projects that I'm going to be working on over the summer. They produce a journal, a Torah journal, that's with articles written by the members of the shul. And so the shul is comprised of guys who are Bali Tshuva or who went to yeshiva, And then they just solicit essays. And I'm hoping that people on this call would consider writing an essay for our journal. I'll speak to you more about it over the course of the next few days. But in any event, there's one section which has two articles on the topic of Dina de Malchusa Dina. And the reason why this has become more prominent in our consciousness during COVID is because of the issue of people abiding by government requirements and restrictions of lockdown when when it means restricting our religious activities. Are we obligated to abide by government requirements of not congregating and not assembling our schools and so forth and so on, in light of the fact that there is a government requirement that we can't have more than 10 people in a room, and a requirement that our schools have to be closed? Are our schools allowed to remain open? And as you all know, this has been in the news, it's been in the media, that there are schools in our own community that have defied the law, flagrantly defied the law. And not only have they defied the law by keeping schools open, but they've lied openly about it and told government officials lies. In other words, we can't sugarcoat it. It's not that they evaded the truth, it's that they explicitly said bald-faced lies. We are not holding school, we are just holding prayer. And they would actually have the kids hold sitters throughout the day so that if they were visited by government authorities, the kids could say that we are praying when in reality they were being taught in a classroom setting. Okay, and this is not something that I'm making up. It's not something that is alleged. It's something that we know has taken place within our own community. And they were given the response that this is permissible because the laws of Dina de Malchusa are limited only to financial issues. And this is a non-financial issue. This is a question of curtailing our religious freedoms. And therefore, we do not have to abide by the Dina de Malchusa Dina. Now, what about the concern about public health? The public health people don't know what they're talking about, and they're being overly dramatic about it. They're being draconian about it, and they're unfairly restricting us. We're not concerned. We've spoken to our experts, and they've told us that children going to school will not contribute to the spread of the disease, and so forth and so on. Now, has this disregard of public safety, can we argue that it has contributed to actual deaths in the community? Probably, yes, we can. But that's beside the point. I'll let the Ribono Shel Olam deal with who's guilty for causing which deaths, right? But that's not for us to calculate or for us to even take into consideration when we're dealing with halacha. The question is, does Dina de Malchusa extend to laws that do not have to do with finance? In other words, do I have to obey traffic laws? This is something that we were looking at yesterday when we started reading this paragraph. And the poskim seem to all say that Dina de Malchusa, even though it's somewhat murky, does extend to other laws as well. Now, even if you were going to argue, and I want us to look at an essay together, even if you were going to argue that Dina de Malchusa Dina does not extend to issues that are non-financial, as far as obeying the laws of the society, we mustn't forget that there are other considerations as well. Remember, we said that the only time that you would be allowed to, even if Dina de Malchusa Dina is not a factor in the observance of a particular halacha, there's also the Chilul Hashem factor. And that's been clear in all of the literature that we've seen so far, is that the only time that you can even think about disobeying the law, because you can argue that Dina de Malchusa does not apply, is only when there's not a Chilul Hashem. And that seems to have been forgotten about. in whatever calculus was made to allow these schools to remain open. They forgot about the Chilul Hashem factor, and I guess their argument is that Chilul Hashem doesn't. We don't have to worry about it because we're dealing with like on Shtisel, Shulam's brothers, it's Rishoyim Arurim. It's like they're the bad guys or whatever it is, whatever the argument is. But I wanted to point out that this is actually a real issue that's discussed in the poskim. Rav Asher Weiss is only one of many, many poskim who has a discussion about this. I thought it would be worthwhile because I think all of you have heard of Rav Asher Weiss. He's a contemporary posek, and can everyone see the screen that I just changed to? He writes, and this is in Minchas Asher, Volume 2. Choshen Mishpat Siman Kuf Chaf Aleph is the number of the responsum, and this is section 5. He in the previous sections he has carefully traced the different opinions as to what the basis of the law of Dina de Malchusa Dina is, and it's clear that that it is a law, and it is a subject of debate as to what the reason for Dina de Malchusa is. Let me just, I'm over here, so why don't we start over here? He says, Nistapakti, im yesh dina de malchusa dina gam bechukim v'takanos shelatoelas hatzibor tuknu ach einam b'dinein momenus. He says, I'm deliberating as to whether the law of Dina de Malchusa applies when laws are instituted that are for the benefit of the community, the benefit of the citizenry, but they are not under the rubric of financial law. Such as traffic laws or other laws that are designed for the public safety. Yesh chok shemechayev kol mosad chinuchi lahatchin ma'arechet automatit shel kibui eish. So he says, I was asked by an American entity, by an organization that oversees Jewish schools, and they asked me the following shaila. There's a governmental law somewhere in the United States which requires every school to install an automatic fire extinguishing system in the school. He says, and this is a law that was created or instituted by the government for the safety of the children who are going to be in that building, because most of the buildings are made from wood in that particular area. So must we say that we are obligated, just as much as we would obligated to fulfill any biblical law, based on the principle of Dina de Malchusa Dina, to install a fire extinguishing system in our school, or could we evade that law because it's not under the rubric of Dina de Malchusa Dina? He says we could also ask this question about traffic laws and tavru'ah. Let me just see what the word tavru'ah means. Does any Israelis on the line? What does tavru'ah mean? Just type that into my Google Translate. Tavru'ah. Sanitation laws. Do we have to abide by the sanitation laws? Okay. And v'dugma nosefet l'she'ela zu b'medi not misuyamot shebishat hitpartzut machalot misuyamot hachok mechayev kvutzot sikun lihitchasein. He says another example of this would be in certain countries, that when there's an outbreak of certain diseases, and by the way, this responsum was written several years ago, so it's not being written about COVID. He says if there's an outbreak of a certain illness, the law requires certain groups who are endangered to get a vaccine. would people be obligated to get vaccinated? And here he's talking about, the anti-vaxxers who are, part of various religious communities. We know that there were anti-vaxxers long before COVID in some pockets of the religious community. Are we obligated to abide by the laws, the vaccination laws? He says, now, on the one hand, you could argue that every example of Dina de Malchus Dina that is presented by the Talmud is of a financial nature, that we have to abide by either laws of taxation or laws of confiscation of property, and so forth. So on the one hand, one could say that all you see from the Gemara is that you have to abide by Dina de Malchus Dina when it applies to finance. Ach, zil basar taima. However, on the other hand, we could say, but you have to be logical about it. Lefi hamavur le'el, nira lichora de gam be'ela amrina de Dina de Malchus Dina. He says, because it would seem that based upon what we've explained above, that Dina de Malchus Dina doesn't just apply to financial law, but applies to all laws. The halo michovas hamelech letakein takanot l'ravachat hatzibur, lo rak be'inyanei hamamon. He says, because the role of the king or the government is to institute laws that will benefit the society, not just limited to finance. It applies to all aspects of social life. The kaven shenit barer dechol yesod halacha zu me'etzem din hamalchus v'hasrara hu nira lichora the din zeh mechayiv gam linog lefi chukei hamalchus gam binyanim hanal. And therefore, it would seem only logical that that if I have to obey the laws of the land, then it shouldn't just apply to finance, but should apply to other things as well. And he says, "Va'ayin b'shut igros Moshe Choshen Mishpat Chelek Beisim and Lamed," and I refer you to Igros Moshe, which we actually saw inside. Shekasav da'asul talmidim laha'atik b'mibchanim shel hamemshala mishum dina de malchusa, where, if you remember, we talked about a responsum that Rav Moshe had addressed the question: is it permissible for students to cheat on their regents exam in the state of New York if they can get access to the answers? And Rav Moshe had paskin that it's clearly usher for them to do that. Milvad iser genevas das, the iser geneva, in yiskabel la'avod al smach tu'udot shikriot. He says, number one, it's deception, which halachically is a form of geneva. It's called genevas das. Number two, it's real geneva, because you might get hired for a job that you're not qualified for by cheating on an exam, on an entrance exam for a certain position of employment. And so you're actually stealing from your employer by taking a job that you're not qualified for because you cheated on the exam that tests your knowledge. So Rav Moshe states that even when there's no actual loss of money, there's still going to be an Isser of Dina de Malchus Dina based on the fact that you're being deceptive. Okay.
Rabbi, aren't you also stealing a position from someone else who's more capable? Because if they only accept 10 people into a program and you've cheated, you've denied someone who has the knowledge and hasn't cheated.
Yes, precisely. I think that was part of Rav Moshe's truth. I think that's what he said as well in that.
I see. Okay.
In that response. So
is there something, Rabbi, though, about if the laws are anti-Semitic, they single out the Jewish people, then you don't have to follow them? Like, I mean, God forbid if the law said you can't give bris milah or you can't shecht meat or something like that, that singles out specifically, it's not a fair government. Is there something there where we're not obliged to follow?
Possibly, yes. I mean, first of all, you'd have to make the argument that the government is discriminating against the Jewish people. But you're coming up with a very interesting scenario. What if the government is discriminating against Jews and Muslims and not just Jews? And they say that you can't circumcise anymore. So what are you supposed to do in that situation? So that's actually the next chapter, right? Dina de Malchusa, Dina Neged Din Torah. What do you do when the law of the land actually contravenes halacha? It goes against the laws of the Torah. And so maybe that's something that we should take a look at next. He says, Kosav Harashba, Be'echad Shemei Sabito, Betava es Chasanu Shiachsulo es Kol Hanedunya. He says, the Rashba writes the following case. The Rashba lives in the 13th century, 13th, 14th century. And he writes about the following scenario. A man's daughter passes away, and she's a married lady, and she dies, I guess, shortly after she gets married. And so the father has come to his son-in-law, and he says, I would like you to return all of the dowry. And the argument is as follows. The father says that according to Torah law, I inherit my daughter. And according to secular law, a husband inherits his wife, not a father inherits his daughter. So the secular law says that the husband is the heir of his deceased wife. And the halacha says that a father is the heir of his deceased daughter, and the husband gets nothing. The kaven shebamakom moshavim nagu hakol keminag hagoyim kol hanosi isha sham havale kilu chasano linhog ben achalasim keminag hagoyim. And the counter argument is that everyone abides by the law of the land. And the law of the land, the convention is that a husband inherits his wife. So what should be the halacha? The Heishav Harashba, the Afsha B'chol Davar Sheb'mamon to know Kaim Umaslim Binyan Zeh, Aval Asr Linho Kach Mipnei Shuhu Mishpat HaGoyim. And the Rashba surprisingly writes that when it comes to, even though when we say that with monetary matters, usually you abide by any conditions that have been set into the transaction, but you're not allowed to contravene the law, that the halacha that's contained in the Torah, because just because it's the law of the non-Jewish entity. Zelishono, and he says as follows: Be'emes nirali da'asr lefishu mechaket hagoyim. He says it would seem to me that the husband does not have a good valid argument, because he is sort of granting legislative rights over his life to the non-Jewish entity. And the Torah says that you're only supposed to adjudicate yourselves based on Torah law, not based upon Gentile law, which is why we don't go to Gentile courts. We go to a Beis Din. The Afal Pisha Shneim Rotzim Bekach V'Hudavar Shebimamon Shelo Hinicha Torah Es Ha'am Shehu L'Nach L'Lo Al Retzonum She Yiyakru Et Chukot HaGoyim V'Dinehem. And even if both parties consent that the husband will inherit his wife, it still is not proper, because the Torah does not want us to resign ourselves to the laws of the land. The Torah wants us to abide by the rules of the Torah. Va'od hosif sham devarim kashim kegidim neged mi sherat salomar de'achinas linen bazeh basar dinehem v'zelashana. The Rashba further writes very harsh words against someone who wished to argue that we should abide by the secular law. And he writes as follows: Al kain anu po temeim makom ha-mishpat be'ercham makom Torah v'yitram dat. He says, and therefore we, meaning talking about himself, I, the Rashba, am amazed at the people who are trying to argue in favor of abiding by secular law. And of what benefit will you be able to get from money that you have acquired by not abiding by our Torah, but by abiding by secular law? And he writes, "V'harama hevid varav b'simin shin samech tesif yud aleph ayin sham v'chayotze bo kosav gam haradvaz simin tavkuf memhei." And so he writes that others have brought the words of the Rashba, and then he says, and then he brings another responsum. And I'll tell you what, since this is a lengthy tshuva, what I'll try and do is I'll extract the relevant portions, and we'll try and get some clarity on what to do when there's a direct conflict between Torah law and secular law. Certainly, any law that requires us to violate the Torah, we're not allowed to abide by. If secular law says that we have to violate Shabbos, like for example, I got a question a few weeks ago. Someone said that when they were traveling, they're coming back from the United States back into Canada, and the law requires that they have to install an app on their phone, and every single day they have to either call or check in on their app to say that they are abiding by the quarantine. Parenthetically, I was given the same directives when I returned, and I did not abide by that because it was clear to me that the government was not requiring it. It just required it on paper. And we know that there's a particular dispensation that if you know for a fact that the government is not, that there's a law in the books, but the government is not enforcing the law, you're not obligated to abide by Dina de Malchus Dina, which is one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this more, one of the reasons why if a person is speeding on the highway and is going 115 kilometers per hour when the posted speed limit is 100 kilometers per hour, you're not in violation of Dina de Malchus Dina because the police force has made it known that as long as you don't exceed 120 kilometers per hour, they will not ticket you. That's become public knowledge already. Things have been written about it. And the police have made no bones of concealing that information, right? So, but this person was very concerned. They wanted to obey the law, and they were very fearful that they might be fined, or that because this was at a time when things were very scary, it was the beginning of lockdown. And I said, even though we very much abide by Dina de Malchus Dina, that you can't violate Shabbos for the sake of obeying the law. Thank God we live in a country which respects religious liberties, and there are laws that protect our religious liberties. So, as a general rule, we would never be, in a country like ours, we would never be forced to choose between observing halacha versus obeying the law, because there are always going to be exemptions for that. So let's continue this discussion, God willing, in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow, okay?
Right.